21 News, your place for politics. This is Decision 2024.
Election night, it was packed with some upsets for longtime Valley Democrats. Trump winning at the top of the ticket in Ohio and Pennsylvania. And the expensive Senate race in Ohio goes to Bernie Moreno, defeating longtime Democrat Sherrod Brown. A lot to break down here as more numbers still roll in Pennsylvania. We wait to see all of the final results for all of the races. Joining me this week on the 21 News political panel for Decision 2024, we are back with my assistant news director, 21 News political analyst, Justin Mitchell. We're joined today by Andy Resnick, who was with me last night. He's an independent political consultant, and Pat Lowry, former senior advisor to Congressman Tim Ryan and a public relations rep with Co-Counseling. Pat, Andy, thank you for being here because this was something we were watching in real time reporting on, and we were together looking at these numbers thinking, okay, how is this going to shake out? We saw longtime Democrats unseated in Trumbull County sweeping. Some of those races were closer than others. Mahoning County also saw some upsets, especially with the county-wide races. And you also saw Trump take a consecutive win in Mahoning County. So when you look at those numbers in a night like last night and into this week, what does that signal, maybe, you think, for voters in Mahoning County? Pat, I'll start with you because, you were probably watching this thinking, okay, there's a trend here.
So what was interesting to me was when the numbers came in at 87%, most of the Democrats in Mahoning County were still winning at that point. And then it was those final counts that DeCenzo lost, Dave Ditzler lost, and I think there were, and Gina DiGenova lost in those, it seemed to me, in those last counts. But so I think that a lot of this is just my own thinking here, a lot of this is Trump driven. So I think if I'm a Republican, I have to think, how can I sustain this? I'm not sure that they can sustain this into any kind of long-term gains. I think without Donald Trump at the top of the ticket, they lose some of those races, as they did. Democrats won some, Republicans won some in Mahoning. In Trumbull, of course, the Republicans had a clean sweep. But I think a lot of this is driven by the fact that Donald Trump is that person at the top of the ticket, and he has a way of connecting with the disgruntled voter. He just has a knack for that I think others could learn some things from.
And Andy, when you look at the Democratic Party in Mahoning County, they have to be looking at some of these big races thinking, where did we go wrong? Was there anything we could have done to overcome some of that momentum on the local level?
Yeah, look, I think it was a very interesting election night on multiple fronts. And I just, to Pat's point, just to touch on that for a second, I do think that it was, you do have, to an extent, that it is something that can be sustained, right? I think we're looking at a very cultural shift in terms of what the Democratic Party has to face right now, right? That the lines are changing. The makeup of your electorate is changing. And it's going to come down to whichever party can keep up with that. And what we saw last night was Republicans were taking advantage of that and knowing how to do it because they were the ones proactively expanding the map. And that's something that Democrats are going to have to figure out going forward. Locally, I think, look, both Democratic parties are probably taking a very hard look at themselves right now. On the local level, I think, it was out organized, right? They just got out organized. I think that, anytime you get swept like that, it comes down to, are you turning out your voters? And clearly that wasn't happening last night. And that wasn't just Mahoning County. That was really across Ohio. And we saw that with Brown in Cuyahoga County and Franklin County. His numbers just didn't get to where they needed to get to order to sustain what was happening even above him on the ticket.
And Justin, when we talk about Trumbull and Mahoning now seeing these trends, a lot of national attention, national media is on the Mahoning Valley and this part of the state, but also the whole state of Ohio. But when you look at the coverage that we're going to get and also into Western Pennsylvania, do you think a lot of folks are going to start studying this, saying, okay, what's happening in the makeup of these communities? Are we seeing a shift in population, demographic within the certain communities?
Well, they're gonna study all of that to figure out what the secret sauce is here. But the fact is there's a lot of people in this country, not just in Ohio, that woke up this morning feeling that they live in a different country than the one they thought they lived in, because Donald Trump was the one driving this at the top of the ticket. And he did not run a campaign on issues. He ran a campaign on punching down to certain marginalized groups. And he made that central to the campaign. And I think a lot of people thought that this was going to be a much closer race because they didn't think that that would be wholesale embraced. Now, the question becomes, was it wholesale embraced, or did the Democrats fail to meet that moment? Because there was a lower, right now, I mean, there's still votes being counted, but it appears that across the board, there was a lower Democratic turnout by a significant number, like 15 to 20 million votes. And so the Republicans have figured out their secret sauce here. They know what works. It wins them an election. Whether or not it translates to policy and whether or not that policy is any good now, once again remains to be seen. But what the Democrats have done for a few cycles now is mismanage how to reach out to voters where they are. So they've run away from being progressives because they think that scares voters, and it has in past election cycles, but they've run so far away from it that they've given voters nowhere. There's no reason to vote for a Democrat if they're a Republican light. You saw Kamala Harris make Liz Cheney a very, very central part of her campaign. You saw Sherrod Brown run ads. The only counterpunch in a Sherrod Brown ad was to say that he's not supportive of the trans community. And this is as small of a marginalized community as there could be. So there's a little bit of a reverse overreach on the Democrats' part, where they need to figure out who their core constituency is and start speaking to them instead of running from the label they're given by the other party.
Overreach is, I think, a great way to frame that, and I think something that Justin just said kind of triggered in my mind just reactionary. And I think that's what the Democratic Party has been over the last few cycles, is very reactionary. And speaking of that Brown ad, we talked about that on the last panel, right? That was 3 weeks out from an election day. Mm-hmm. And you saw that he proactively responded to an attack ad, to bat it down. That says to me that they had polling showing how effective that was, and they felt the need to get off their strategy and respond. Mm-hmm. Right? When you look at 2006, probably one of the most historically great years for Democrats in terms of congressional elections.
Right. That was the year Sherrod came in.
That's right.
The year Sherrod came in.
That was a year where the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee looked at the map and said, you know what, we're going to win by potentially moving to the middle a little bit in districts where we need to, and we're going to be proactive, and we're going to get after it, right? And if we need to be more left in a district, it's okay to be more left in a district, right? They were able to kind of personalize the messaging, personalize the candidates, and that was effective. And I think what you're seeing right now is Democrats are just, the Democratic Party at least, or at least the operation on the campaign side, are looking around going, where do we go? What do we respond to? Republicans are over here, so we need to counter it with this, and it's just not adding up to a comprehensive strategy.
And you said those other ads, those attack ads, came so late, Pat, right, against Sherrod and saying, okay, he's not going to work with Trump. And that really did feed into maybe some of the last minute votes. What did you think when you saw that strategy at the end of a campaign where allegedly it's neck and neck in the state of Ohio? What went through your mind?
So, the polling suggested that Sherrod was up. I mean, and the polling was fairly consistent about that the polling was up. So I think these late attack ads by the Republicans were quite effective. And I would suggest that for the average person out there, they didn't see the response. There may have been some ads, but again, they didn't see the response. And the other thing that comes to mind for me, and I heard this years ago about Democrats. I don't know if you've heard this anecdote that the Democrats will bring a policy paper to a knife fight. Yes, right? And you know what? And you still heard it in this campaign. You heard about how successful the Biden legislative agenda was, and I think historically, it will probably be, lauded in that sense. It is somewhat historic. But as the Republicans have shown, that's not what brings you votes. Sure. And so, while we're talking about policy, we're talking about how successful this agenda was, they're talking about things that are everyday things. You hear about prices of gas, prices of groceries. You hear about the border. Mm-hmm. And that worked better.
And even Sherrod, he started early. So when you were with Tim and he was campaigning and you've advised him for years, he started out early too. Sherrod talked about shrinkflation. Tim Ryan ran ads saying, hey, I can work with Trump. Sherrod's known to work across the aisle, bipartisan in the state of Ohio. I can't tell you how many stories we've done on steel dumping, him working with Portman in every plant across Northeast Ohio. But there were other things too. So where did that disconnect then happen for the voter? Was it just they were already having tunnel vision saying, you know what, he's not capable of being that person as well?
So I think we can go back to James Carville in 1992, and he was, I watched some of what he did last night also, but Carville said, it's the economy, stupid, famous words that he said. I think it's still that, and I think that the Republicans were better at tapping into that discontent or that anxiety around the economy, even though economic numbers are good, unemployment is down, people are making money in their retirement accounts. All those numbers are pretty robust right now. But I think there's still an anxiety out there. And for example, I think you can take a look at the Valley and suggest that we have not recovered like other parts of the country. And so there still is that discontent, and if not discontent, at least that anxiety about where the economy will be in a couple of years. And how, and this goes down to household by household, how will that benefit me?
Yeah.
And those are the questions that I think people are asking.
When you were running the numbers, Andy, you were talking about, the counties where Sherrod needed to do well last night. Talk about what you noticed in the evening. Yeah. Maybe the both of you can kind of go over what counties and what moments where you say, okay, this isn't looking correct, and where maybe you saw some trends.
Yeah, I think, look, early on, it looked good. And we talked about it, I think, on potentially our first break-in, we were talking about those early returns coming back, and it looked like he was trending in the 70s and where he needed to be, and that was hopefully going to trend up as the numbers came back in. And then I think later on, once we started looking at some of those suburban counties that were coming in, those were more even, right? He started performing a little bit closer to where Ryan was performing. I think in a couple of them, he was even tied with Harris in some of them instead of outperforming Harris. And those were some indicators that you saw as well. If he's going to really fight back a Trump win in Ohio, he needs to be overperforming here, not on par with Harris or even underperforming her or Ryan from 4 years ago in those same counties. And then Hamilton County, I think, was really the one where we looked at that last night and said, okay, this is going to be a problem. If he can't get up above 65% in the Cincinnati area at this point in the evening, that's something that's a red flag. And that, I think, actually ended up carrying through. And by the end of the night, you looked at Cuyahoga County, and I think, when we were looking at it that last time, right after they called it, as Cuyahoga was coming in, every time a new batch of numbers came in, his number kept dropping further down into the 60s. And it was going that wrong direction.
I early on talked to some of people who were working with Sherrod on some of this, and they were counting on some crossover votes. Yeah. They knew they had to outperform Harris by significant numbers to make this work, because they knew that Trump was going to win Ohio. But at the same time, I can't name the counties right now, but I can tell you that we were watching some of the counties to see how Sherrod was doing compared to how Tim was doing in the Senate race of 2022. And Sherrod was not, in some of those counties, Sherrod was not doing any better than Tim did.
Right.
And so therefore we knew that there was going to be trouble for Sherrod, obviously.
Was there anything that they didn't do that you thought, man, that was a missed opportunity for either candidate? I mean, both of them did not debate. Bernie Moreno ran a campaign, mostly just ads. You didn't, have a lot of long interviews. We had no debate on our station. We asked for a debate, and we invited them both on the set. Neither showed up for tough questions. They wanted to not answer those, apparently. So was that a mistake for maybe one of them, not to give more time to the voter to explain themselves?
So let me say this. I can't question the debate strategy. I don't know how much of an impact that has on any given election, although there are certain debates that we know have had huge impacts on how things have turned out. But the one thing I remember going back to Obama in 8 and 12, and I realize that the world has changed and social media has changed since then, but they were relentless about turnout. And if they knew, first of all, for example, that if they registered 7 people, that they probably were going to get 4 to 5 of those votes. They knew, and then they were relentless about making sure they knew when you voted. They knew when you voted. And And one of the things that I've suggested since those times is that no one has seemed to use that model.
Yeah.
And I think with the data that's out there and the software that's out there, you know who your voters are, you know how many votes you need to win. It's your job to go get them. And I just still don't see candidates using that sort of strategy to do that.
That's a great point again, and I think, look, the line of work that we're both in now, right, more on the private corporate side, that's organizing 101, right?
That's
So
exactly right.
That's community
Exactly
organizing, right? Go find one person, they're going to tell 2 friends, that turns into 4 friends, 6 friends, whatever it is, and that number continuously grows. And you mentioned Obama, and when you look back at that race, that's what Obama built, right? He built a community of voters who were enthusiastic to go out there and vote and bring their friends and make sure everybody knew that they were voting for him, because that was just the momentum that he brought to the table. And Trump does that as well on the Republican side. Whether you agree with the policies or agree with how he's gone about it through his verbiage and whatnot, he has built that effective community on the Republican side, and that wasn't countered with anything on the Democratic side last night.
It's quite a playbook, and the media playbook, we felt as if this was a very different Senate race than the last. We had long form interviews with both candidates, taking tough questions, debating each other, really fleshing out a lot of issues in front of everyone. The strategy now, we had the other presidential debate did not happen.
Right.
We had no Senate race debate happen. We didn't get to learn more about the incumbent. I think there were some questions about some of the ads that he ran, and then also the ones against him that we would have liked to have asked him about himself on the record. You didn't get to learn much. It was just, here's the information served up to you the way we want to dish it out. You have to take it. Social media, web. Go ahead and weigh in on that on a media strategy standpoint. Is that going to be a long-term trend? Because we have a lot of questions over here.
Well, I do think it's a long-term trend, and I think that it's because it works. Basically, you can win a campaign on vibes. You don't win a campaign on issues. Yeah. People throw that around there. This one talked enough about issues. I mean, that was something they said about Harris. She didn't talk enough about where her position were on the issues. But meanwhile, not true. It's a vibe thing, because she talked a lot about her positions and Donald Trump didn't talk a lot and Bernie Moreno didn't talk a lot about issues. It's all vibes. And basically the vibes come down to hope or hate, and both motivate people. And if you're on the defensive, and this time around the Democrats were on the defensive across the board, then the dark vibe can motivate people, and you're not motivating anybody. You mentioned Obama 08 and 12, and everybody remembers hope and change, and everybody remembers hope and change from Clinton in the 90s too. These are vibes. These are not issues. Yep. What motivates people is they simply are not, for better or worse, they're not really educating themselves on the finer points of policy. They learn that once people are in office, and then they decide whether they like it or not. Not a good way to run a system, not a good way to choose your vote, but it is the way it happens. It's all vibes. It's hope and it's hate.
I have a question, because now I think as the headlines shake out and we start to get through the day, the week, you're going to think ahead and think, oh, wait, we have another U.S. Senate race coming up in Ohio. J.D. Vance is moving to the White House as VP. There are some other names getting floated out there for Senate. I want to know what you're hearing. Anybody you think would be a good choice, or do you think this is going to take a minute to kind of regroup?
Mine would be pure speculation.
Okay,
that's probably
fine.
more well connected.
Yeah, it's super early.
As far as pure speculation, we were talking about Frank LaRose last night, right? Like, where does he go right now? It's assumed that he wants to have higher office. He's kind of blocked in terms of how he gets there at this point. It's potentially a perfect opportunity for either him or the lieutenant governor to kind of clear that path a little bit for one of them to go into the Senate.
So I've heard a couple things. Obviously, Governor DeWine has the power to appoint. And then what I heard, and I don't know if this is true, but this again is speculation, that they will wait until the midterms to have a Senate election for the final 2 years of the term. So whoever's picked by DeWine can serve for 2 years. And I have to admit, I don't know state law on that, so I don't know how that might work. But I've heard kind of the same names floated. But the other question would be, if DeWine or if those groups want to avoid a nasty primary fight, which we hear is coming, this is an opportunity for DeWine to choose one of those people and take them out of the mix for that. So I always joke that if you want to predict politics tomorrow, you will probably be wrong.
So the betting is not something you would advise.
No,
Okay.
I would not do that.
Oh my.
I
Exactly.
mean, we're working on a story on this today, and we've talked to we talked to 3 different analysts. I know Bill Binning is one of them, and I forget who the other 2 were off the top of my head because Caitlin McCarthy's working on this story today, and they rattled off a few names. LaRose is on the list. Matt Dolan is one that's been mentioned, and
Back again.
and also Jane Timken was mentioned by one of them.
Absolutely.
Now, I would throw in as a dark horse, to Pat's point, that Dave Yost wants to be governor, and so does John Husted. So
right.
you could cut that
Those are
there.
the 2
Now,
that I'm thinking about.
I don't get the sense that Mike DeWine and Dave Yost get along that well, and DeWine's pragmatic, but I don't know that he's tossing him a bone like that. I think it probably is LaRose, because whoever it is, whenever it is, they're going to have to make it through a primary. And even though Matt Dolan is kind of on paper, sort of Johnny Republican, he checks every box except that he one time didn't endorse Donald Trump, and he's marked forever there, and he's going to have a hard time in a primary. Whereas Frank LaRose has been sufficiently subservient to that agenda, and
a good
again,
soldier.
Yes, and he does not have any other path to get there, and he said he wants it. I don't even think that's speculation. He said he wants to be a senator.
Yeah, he has aspirations to go bigger for sure.
So I think he's probably the one.
All right. A lot to watch. What do you think may happen when all of this is said and done in some of the big think tanks, when you look at the state races, the national races, down to the local level? What would be your advice to any campaign coming out of this year? I'll start with you, Andy.
Yeah, I think you're looking at stripping it back down to the basics, right? It's to Pat's point earlier, what's the data look like? What's the numbers look like? Get back to that basic campaigning. Before you enter a race, take a look at the landscape. What's my win number in each precinct? Where are my most persuadable precincts? What are the messages that matter? And how do I put those boots on the ground to be able to move those voters and ensure I can identify them throughout the campaign and get them out to the polls? I think we've lost that, right? And it's, I remember managing campaigns, and you're working off of this massive Excel sheet where you're just changing cells all day, going, all right, well, I'm going to spend next week over in this precinct because they're the most persuadable, and we talked about this message last week, and it seems to be moving them, and I'm going to identify 55% of them, and it's going to be dropped into my GOTV bucket, and then those are going to be the voters in the last 3 weeks of the election. I'm going to spend all day in their precincts knocking on their doors and dragging them to vote. That seems to have been lost on the local level in the last few years. I've lived in this area since 2016. I've had one candidate knock on my door. One candidate has knocked on my door. And I can promise you that candidate was not doing it in a targeted way.
And Pat, would you say,
So-
you mentioned the playbook, but you also mentioned economy, the things that average voters relate to, their everyday life.
True, but at the local level, the dynamic is very different. And I'm a firm believer in what he said about one person knocking on his door. I'm a firm believer in retail politics.
Yes.
You have to meet that voter. You have to go to their door. You have to go to those events. And I do think maybe because of social media that we've lost some of that to do that. You want to, it's hard at this level. Let's take if I can take an example of the county clerk. Most of us don't know on a day-to-day basis what the county clerk does, and I don't want to be disrespectful to that work because I'm sure it's important work. But there are political offices that we don't know a lot about how the work goes. All we want to know is if the person is qualified, and if they show up at my door, I can't imagine that party affiliation may not even play into that situation, right? That they're the ones who came to my door. They're the ones who asked me for my vote. That works. To me, that works.
There's an enthusiasm gap in every election, but I think just as importantly that gets overlooked, an authenticity gap. And if you could take that all the way up to the national level last night, I think that was one of the motivating factors as well in terms of what Trump has built within the Republican Party. He comes across as more authentic versus a lot of the Democratic candidates that have gone up against him, or at least gone up even nationally lately, right? Or in states and local elections. There's just, people want authenticity. They want to know that what they're hearing is what they're going to get, and they might not like it, but they know what to expect. They're not going to know that this guy's going to tell me something or girl's going to tell me something, and then in 2 weeks they're going to poll it a different way, and they're going to reverse.
They want the consistency.
Yeah.
They want to know what they're getting at the end of the day.
You know, George Carlin once did a bit about Bill Clinton versus Bob Dole back in the mid-90s, and he hit that point exactly where he said, you know, Bob Dole would get up there and say, I'm an honest man. And they'd go, I don't trust that politician. And Bill Clinton would get up there and go, I'm full of it, and how do you like that? And they'd go, at least he's honest about how full of it he is.
That's right.
Yeah, definitely a battle. Well, I really appreciate all of you being here. Definitely a long night and a long day after. It's a very rough day after an election when you've been working all night long. But, you know, you want to go ahead and go through these numbers and see some of the scenarios. We definitely found some trends here. So I really appreciate you joining me. Again, you can watch this political panel over on WFMJ.com, the 21 News app. And make sure you click subscribe over on the WFMJ YouTube channel. We'll see you there.